Gear Tasting Radio is brought to you by Imminent Threat Solutions. ITS provides knowledge that empowers individuals with indispensable skill sets to explore the world and prevail against all threats. Right now, as a special thank you for all podcast listeners, we're offering 10% off in the ITS store. Simply use the code GTR to save 10% at store.itstactical.com. Welcome to Gear Tasting Radio, where we offer an in-depth look into the usage and philosophy behind the equipment in our lives. I am joined by Robert Henderson.
Hello.
Robert Henderson.
Whatever.
And I'm Brian Black. Today, we are going to talk about radios.
But wait, we've already talked about radio.
Yes, but I'm really going to get into the nitty-gritty today because I think it's important to kind of talk about the things that I've written about in the past in articles, not only when it comes to picking a transceiver, which I'll get into what that is in a second, but not only picking your radio, but understanding the frequencies that it operates on, and I guess the general gist of why you should pick one over the other or use one frequency over the other. So there's going to be some nerdy stuff that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty. I really have notes this time, just so I don't forget to say anything. These are all things that really I kind of keep in the back of my head, and some things I really don't think about until I'm really trying to explain this concept to somebody. So this all kind of spun about because one of our life members and muster attendees, Scott, lives up in Alaska, and they recently had an earthquake up there. And, he posted in one of our Facebook groups for muster alumni on some radio options, that he could have. So, it kind of got my wheels turning and thought, this is a perfect topic for Gear Tasting Radio. So that's where I want to start today. Now, Rob and I have, as you know, we've talked briefly in the past, or extensively kind of, about our
Some people think it's brief, some people think it's extensive.
Our amateur radio licenses that we got. So we took our technician license and we got those. Did pretty good. However, personally, I've fallen off of that because I just haven't used it. It's really one of those use it or lose it kind of things.
Yeah, I don't think I could pass the exam right now.
I don't either. I mean, it was kind of like a cramming for a test type thing. And
yep.
I mean, in the moment, I really knew that stuff.
Right.
However, it's just been so long. I think that if I were presented with a question in terms of can you do this, can you do that, I would probably remember those type of things of what you can and can't do, or at least know I should look it up before I go try to do something.
Well, and I'm a learn by doing kind of person, and so if I could have seen someone set the tone on a repeater and explained that more in depth of, hey, you have one input frequency and you have one output frequency, that would have given me a little bit more knowledge, because once I got my technician license, I got a radio. I was like, I'm so ready, and I keyed up, and nobody could hear me because I didn't have my stuff programmed right. So that's one of the things that they don't really go over much. And yeah, it is like you're cramming for a test, and then you're done, and you're like, and that's gone.
Yeah.
So.
It's, amateur radio is great.
Yeah.
And certainly it's got its place in emergency situations. And we will talk about that, but I really wanted to start first at the core of, what a radio is, how it transmits on those frequencies, and kind of the differences between radios that are on the market. So where I want to start is with something that everybody knows and everybody has probably seen. If you didn't play around with walkie-talkies when you were growing up, you've at least seen the little handheld radios that they have in Walmart or Academy or whatever sporting goods store.
40-mile range.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a misnomer, too, with those kind of radios. Now, with the radios that you had when you were a kid, more than likely the little walkie-talkies, so there's two things. There's power, which is wattage, and there's frequency, which is amplitude. So your frequency is going to travel a certain distance based on the power that your radio is output on. So basically, your radio should tell the frequency you're transmitting on what or how far to send that based on the power it's transmitting on. So you can picture that as like a little wind-up car. So as you pull it back and you let it go, the the further you pull it back, the farther it's going to go. So that's kind of how wattage works. It's a crude definition, but I think it kind of works in this context.
Higher the wattage, the farther you go.
Correct. Yeah, and I think I had that right. Amplitude,
Yeah.
so frequency, amplitude, yeah. So the other factor in that is the frequency is a number. That's how kind of radios are programmed, if you will. So those little radios that you buy at the store are FRS radios. So that's Family Radio Service. They have a specific number of frequencies they can operate on. Mm-hmm. They have a specific wattage of power they can transmit on, and they also have features that are specific to FRS radios that the FCC regulates. So it has to have a fixed antenna. It can't transmit more than a half a watt of power, and it can only transmit on so many frequencies. And I think I wrote them down here. So FRS is 14 frequencies. Mm-hmm. And it's in the VHF band, which, to kind of get a little geeky on this, you've got VHF, which is very high frequency. You've got UHF, which is ultra high frequency. And so just remember lower, longer, higher, shorter, right? Isn't that how it goes?
Yeah.
Lower, long, yeah. So the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength is going to be when it transmits. So I'm going to have to refer to my notes just so I don't get this wrong. VHF is in the 30 to 300 megahertz spectrum.
Yep.
UHF is in the 300 megahertz to 3 gigahertz spectrum. And, like I said, lower frequency equals longer wavelength and greater penetrating power. That's what I didn't want to forget to say, too. So, if you're thinking about being inside of a building and trying to punch through a wall to get communications through, you want a longer wavelength in the VHF spectrum to do so. And it's not saying that UHF can't penetrate walls and things like that. And it's also not saying that UHF isn't great for outdoors or indoors. It's just, technically speaking, VHF is better for things like that. However...
And so this is always funny to me because you will go search a question. You'll say, how far can the Kenwood radio transmit? And every single place you'll go, the answer will be, it depends.
Yeah.
Because if you're transmitting from the basement of a concrete building, it's not going to transmit as far as if you were standing on top of the roof of the building, because interference is like the number one biggest factor when it comes to radio waves of they bounce. And so if you're in something that doesn't allow penetration and it bounces off of there, you may not even get out of the room you're in, depending on what it's made of. Mm-hmm. So that's why this seems dense knowledge-wise, but it's important to cover because it gives the understanding that there's not one radio that's get this radio, it'll transmit everywhere, because that's not how radios work.
Correct. And so to talk further about the misnomer that FRS radios carry is that when you go to the store, you're going to see these stated transmit distances of 1 mile and 40. I've seen 40 miles on an FRS radio, and I'm dude, it is a half a watt of power. There is no way in hell you're going to get that distance. And this is what they do. So FRS, when it transmits, it generally transmits in a straight line as it goes the distance. So, as it travels, it's bouncing in a wave format, but the further out it gets, it's going to just go in a straight line. So if you think about the curvature of the Earth, right, and you think about a straight line traveling from your radio where you are on the ground, you would have to raise an antenna so far in the air to get that straight line to hit it. So think about a straight line intersecting an antenna. So as you reach the curvature of the Earth and that straight line is going, that antenna that's on the other side of the curvature of the Earth, I'm trying to draw this out of my head because it's just ridiculous. Well, it would have to be miles tall, and that's what they do.
They'd have to stand on a mountain and transmit down so it can curve. And I think what they do to get their ratings.
It's one of the greatest marketing gimmicks in the world. It really is.
But it's not 40 miles. Let's be honest.
Yeah,
you can get some of those radios, and they may not even hit the edge of a building.
Yeah, you'd be lucky if you jump in a car and you're jumping in the car right behind that car, and you can't even get each other on an FRS radio.
Yeah, it turns out they don't know what miles mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it is one of those things of in perfect conditions with the elevation right, you could hit 40 miles. But they also don't say that the communication will be intelligible when it gets there. So it may just be that they're sending data packets or something and getting those 40 miles. It doesn't mean that you're going to get
We heard a squawk.
Quality. Yeah. Good enough.
They got it.
We can go to 40 now.
Yeah. We can put that on the package.
Right.
And then you put a little asterisk that says, like, your mileage may vary.
Right. Probably not 40 miles.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say that as just so you guys know, if you're researching radio, it's all about power.
Yep.
So yes, the antenna matters. Yes, the frequency matters, but really the wattage that the radio is outputting that transmission on is the real power behind the radio, and that's really what's going to travel the distance. So as we keep going with this, like I said, FRS is those 14 frequencies. They've got a half a watt of power that they are regulated on. Just to put it in perspective, too, the little walkie-talkies I was talking about, that's like 0.1. So a FRS wattage power is 5 times the power of a little handheld walkie-talkie you had when you were a kid, just to put that in perspective. So the next step up from FRS is like a GMRS, so that's General Mobile Radio Service. And that is a FCC-regulated frequencies. There are multiple frequencies in GMRS, and 7 of those are shared with FRS. So when you are transmitting on GMRS, this is confusing, I know. When you're transmitting on GMRS, those 7 frequencies that are shared with FRS are mandated still to be on a half a watt of power. However, the other 16 of those frequencies that are in GMRS can be transmitted on with 5 watts of power. So therefore, when you're talking about like the Baofeng radio, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or a Waksun radio, these radios are capable of transmitting at 5 watts of power. And 5 watts of power is pretty good for a handheld transceiver. And just to back up, I mentioned transceiver in the beginning. So transmit, receive, hence transmitter or transceiver. So you combine transmission capability and receiving capability, you have got a transceiver, and this is a handheld transceiver. Lots of people refer to them as radios. I still call them radios, but at the end of the day, some nerd is going to correct you and say,
if someone calls it a transceiver, you know you're dealing with a high-class nerd.
Yeah, right. I don't even call it transceiver, right. And I consider myself a pretty big nerd. Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, that's GMRS. You have to have a license for GMRS, but there's no test. It is literally create a login on the FCC website, pay your $90, and get a GMRS license. It's good for 5 years, and now you can magically transmit on those frequencies.
That's not a license, that's a tax.
Yeah, right.
If you have to pay for it, and there's no test.
Right. Anyway, you get a little fancy FCC certificate in the mail. I have one. It's actually due for renewal next year. So I actually looked at that before this conversation because I was curious about my GMRS license.
Are you going to renew?
Yeah,
nice.
Just to have it.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing I want to talk about with emergency communications too. GMRS is actually a great option for that because not only can you transmit on those 5 watts of power, but you can use repeaters with that. So there's no restriction. You can have a detachable antenna. You can transmit on 5 watts of power, transmit and receive, as well as use repeaters. So we'll get into repeaters later. I still haven't figured out all the nuances of repeaters. I understand the general nature of how to use repeaters. I personally have not programmed repeaters or repeater frequencies in. I've seen them used before on other people's transceivers.
It's a pain.
But yeah, it's a pain in the butt, but it's not out of the realm of possibility, and it could save your butt in an emergency situation because you could communicate with your wife on another handheld transceiver miles away. So I have successfully we've got comms probably 2-3 miles away, probably 3 miles away at muster events that we've had in the past with these, with the 5 watts of power. So anyway, that's just kind of a rough
which is
idea
very
with that.
Indicative of the false claims of the 40-mile range that a 5-watt radio is only getting about 2 to 3 miles, which to me is more realistic.
You know what? I said that wrong. So let's back up. So those 7 frequencies that are shared with FRS in GMRS can transmit on 5 watts of power.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought they were gated. Okay.
No, they're not gated to the half watt. They are 5 watts. I said that wrong.
FRS guys, if you're
Apologies. Someone's already yelled at me. But then the other 16 have a max of 50 watts.
Wait,
so there's
how many GMRS channels are there?
16 plus 7 is
23.
21.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
16 plus 7 is 23. Yeah.
We got it.
Anyway, those are UHF frequencies. They're mandated by the license. However, and that's where the power comes into that is 50 watts. You're not going to get a 50-watt handheld transceiver, at least I haven't seen one, but you can use like a base station to transmit 50 watts of power. So meaning that if you had a base station in your home, a friend had one in their home, and they were quite a distance apart, and you were using a repeater, you're probably going to be able to communicate across the state. So at least across the city, or if not metroplex, if not state. So that's a pretty, and you can bounce repeaters too. So it's not like you have to just have one repeater between those stations. You can go repeater to repeater to repeater to repeater. Keep going with repeaters. Anyway, kind of to dial it back a little bit, the other frequencies that are open to you are MURS frequencies. Those do not require a license. And there's 5 frequencies, but however, they are a max of 2 watts on those frequencies. So MURS is great. I personally really like MURS frequencies because they're not used as much. You don't wind up stepping over other people. You're not as likely to run into other people on those channels. So I think it's a great option to run on, little handheld transceivers like this. However,
I was going to say,
this is a gray area because a lot of people say that the FCC will come down on you because your radio is capable of transmitting at 5 watts and you are unable to program those MURS frequencies to only transmit and receive on 2 watts of power, which, that's technically correct. However, I'll just leave it at that.
So something I see on the BFA all the time is that people will chastise you for purchasing it and saying, "Oh, you need a license" or things like that.
So it's a Part 90 certification that you need.
But the FCC only governs transmission. They don't govern listening. They don't govern, listening to a frequency. So if you have a BFA radio and you're thinking about getting your ham radio license or anything, you are perfectly able to dial in and listen to repeater traffic. You just can't transmit on it. That's what the FCC governs.
Correct. And so what I talked about with the Part 90, I'm looking at the back of my Walksoon radio. So this thing says FCC ID. It's got an ID on it. It says this device complies with Part 90 of the FCC rules. Operation is subject to conditions that device does not cause harmful interference. Anyway, so that's what a radio needs to have technically to operate on a lot of these frequencies that the FCC mandates. And the problem is that people say these Walksoons don't have a Part 90 certification. There is no label on the inside that says anything about a Part 90 certification. So it is what it is. I'm not going to advocate you breaking the law, but however, I don't know. I think it's a minor hiccup in terms of communications. And especially like Rob said, if it's an emergency, all bets are off. You can even operate on ham frequencies in an emergency. So meaning transmitting on a ham frequency that you do not have a license for is okay in an emergency situation.
Yep.
And I mean true emergency. I'm not talking about like, hey, I forgot to get the eggs. Can you pick those up on your way home? That's not an emergency.
I think their law is loss of life or property.
Yeah.
Is their stipulation.
Right.
So if it's loss of life or property, getting eggs, not.
And then the next thing to move on to is CB, because you see CB radios around a lot. That's called the Citizens Band. It's typically a 4-watt power output is what it's kind of limited to, or you can go up to 12 watts on single sideband or SSB. You've got 40 frequencies. That's HF. That's the HF band, the high frequency band. Technically, you're supposed to operate for only 5 continuous minutes. Then you have to jump off for a minute before you can transmit again for another 5 minutes. Nobody does that, especially in the trucker world. But
CB is the back alley of the radio world.
Yeah,
it's a no man's land.
Yeah. The only thing that's mandated on there is Channel 9 is for emergency purposes only, so everybody stays off of Channel 9 unless you've got an emergency. So it can be good to have in a vehicle for not only vehicle-to-vehicle communication, so it's great for like off-roading stuff, and you'll see a lot of adventure vehicles with big antennas sticking up out of them. More than likely, that's a CB. Sometimes guys have their ham license or their amateur radio license, and they'll use that to communicate, but more than likely, they've got ham as well, CB as well, because most people don't have their amateur radio license, and you can't operate on that unless you have one, so they typically just communicate vehicle to vehicle with CB, and you can typically reach out decent distances with CB to be able to communicate. Like if you're driving in a caravan on the road, CB's great for that. You can bounce that vehicle to vehicle, no problem, as long as you have a good antenna. And
it's super ubiquitous.
Yeah, you just have to make sure that you hook it up the right way and that there's no interference in the signal. I forget the little tester that you put on there, what it's called.
It's, you're supposed to get
got
it to
a little
zero.
needle. Yeah, anyway. But yeah,
Like
just hook it up the
impedance.
right way. I think I wrote an article on that too. But anyhow, lots of this stuff that we're going to talk about, you don't necessarily have to remember or write down in the podcast. We have articles for that, and we will list them at the end of the podcast in the episode intel.
And if you send us $70, we'll give you a license.
We'll give you access to these
No
said
testing
articles.
required.
Yeah, the last thing kind of frequency-wise that I wanted to mention is the NOAA frequencies. So that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric something.
Agency.
God, yeah, I think
Sounds
that's
good.
what it is.
Weather people.
Weather. It's Weather Channel. So you may have heard the little voice that comes on and be like, there'll be a cloudy chance of shower. Yeah, that's the NOAA transmission. So depending on where you live in the United States, one of those 7 channels on the VHF frequency will get you dialed in on the weather. And I would highly recommend you figure out which one that is and program it into your transceiver so that you have the option of tuning into that, because that can really be instrumental in an emergency too. If you don't have any power, at least you'll be able to hear what's going on with the weather. It can be long and drawn out. It takes a while for them to get back around to the actual weather. So.
It helps also if you're lonely.
Yes.
Turn on the Weather Channel and listen to it while you try to sleep.
There you go. I used to fall asleep to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but those are kind of the main things with that. When you're talking about radios too, the most ubiquitous program I think that's on the market is Chip. That's a
Chirp.
Oh, sorry, Chirp. Yeah,
One of the two.
that's a free program you can download for programming. You will have to have a programming cable though. However, to get what you're creating frequency-wise in Chirp over to your transceiver.
And I super recommend it because programming one by hand is
Yes.
a pain.
It can be done, but
Yes.
it's a very big pain in the butt.
It took a couple hours for me to get one properly tuned.
So, I mean, with these 2 radios I'm holding, I've got a Baofeng. This is a BF F8, which I forget what the most common Baofeng is. But this is,
UV5R.
yeah, UV5R. This is the most, this is the newer style, basically, for this. And it's got an extended battery on it. The Waksun I'm holding is the UV5D. That's their kind of baseline Waksun. But a lot of these share the same characteristics. Detachable antenna. They've got a speaker mic cable so you can run a push-to-talk or a microphone or a little headset. They've also got they were also both dual band so that you can monitor 2 frequencies but only transmit on one. So meaning that what you're listening to on your transceiver is 2 different frequencies coming in on here, and they can overlap each other if people are talking on both of those frequencies at once. However, when you key up the radio and you're actually transmitting and talking into it, you are only talking or transmitting on one of those frequencies. So you have to make sure you've got that selected properly. It can be great for squads and teams that are working together, and somebody's got to monitor a base camp type operation. That's where dual band can come into play. Like at our muster events, we have staff and we have students basically. So they're all operating on one specific frequency. We're operating on another. However, we like to monitor those communications to make sure nothing's wrong and there's no emergency going on with and make sure they're not playing,
not plotting against
playing
us.
games over there.
Yeah.
That's how we monitor that. So we'll monitor theirs. We won't talk to them on that frequency, but we've at least got it monitoring. And then most of these radios that are advanced enough have a keypad, and like we were saying, that's where you kind of set your preferences as well as program if you want to do it manually. It's a bad idea. Highly recommend a program to transfer those. But you can create something like a comms card where you have your frequencies listed. So 30 different frequencies can be hard to remember what's what. So that card can kind of act as a little cheat. You can laminate it, keep it in your pocket. That's what I like to do. So that can be a great way to go as well. And these are the 2 most common radios on the market, I think. people would say that ICOM is a pretty popular brand as well.
Yeah,
so
you start stepping into ham when you start getting into ICOM, Kenwood, Yaesu. They make a lot of ham radios, which are fine, but those are definitely more expensive radios. The Baofengs are cheap.
Yeah,
Super
and that's
cheap,
the other part.
Like $35-$40.
Yeah. And I would highly recommend getting the extended battery. And I don't know, some of you might have seen our little teaser video on Instagram, but we have made a pouch for the Baofeng with the extended battery. So that's coming soon this week to ITS. But I really think it's one of the best designs out there. I have been working on this for years because years ago we had a problem at one of our muster events, and somebody accidentally dropped a radio in the dark at night while they were walking around, and John Hurth tracked it down because he's a bloodhound and found the radio. However, it was almost a bad day, especially for the guy that lost it. But
he was punished.
Yes, so he didn't dummy cord his radio and was a dummy and lost it. So I like the little retractors, and I'll talk about all this on, I guess, Questions Over Coffee, because we've got something like that coming later in the week.
Tune in.
Yeah. So I won't get too much into it, but I will say that we've designed something with 4 levels of retention, so it takes the dummy out of the equation. So I'm looking forward to releasing that. But I guess that's really the gist of what I wanted to talk about. I mean, we didn't really mention antennas. You really just need to make sure that the frequency you're operating or receiving and transmitting on matches what the antenna specifics are. Typically, they're called high gain antennas, so you want to make sure that you're matching your antenna properly to the radio. And then also the connector too. That's something you want to pay attention to, whether it's got basically a SMA or BNC attachment, and whether that attachment is male or female on the antenna or the transceiver. Make sure that's matched up because you don't want to buy the wrong parts. And programming cables are readily available on Amazon as well, so that's where you can get those. We'll put some links in there for those as well. But that's hopefully that kind of digs into the nitty-gritty and geekiness of radios. There's a whole lot more, trust me.
Oh, yes.
And I've probably been yelled at a few times for what we've been saying.
Give it a couple minutes, you can hit send on that comment.
Yeah. I've been trying to keep to my notes here, so hopefully I didn't screw anything up too bad, and I hope you enjoyed it. All right, thanks for listening to Gear Tasting Radio. Remember, if you have questions, use the pound tag Gear Tasting on a social media network, and we'll find them and get them answered here on the show. Check out our crew leader membership linked in the episode intel, along with everything we talked about today. We'll have plenty of links because this is stuff you need to know, and it's very geeky, so hence a lot of links, a lot of things to read. But the membership that's linked there as well will kind of allows us to give you back something in return for your support. So we really appreciate that. If the crew leader membership isn't for you and you still want to help us out, subscribing on Apple Podcasts to the podcast and leaving a review would very much help us out. Reviews help the show grow and get in front of new listeners. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.